Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special book launch event for Banks by Grantlee Kieza, OAM. My name is Bianca. I'll be your avid reader event host tonight, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all. Firstly, if you haven't attended an online event with Avid Reader before, I'll briefly reiterate a couple of things that were sent on email with the link you received. So there is a chat function built into Zoom that will allow you to communicate directly with your host, myself. When we call for audience questions, this is where you can type them in so I can read them out aloud. Please feel free to send through your questions at any time during the event, and I'll do a couple of call outs in the chat function also. One important note I'll pass on shortly in the chat is a link to where you can purchase your copy of Banks. And for the next 24 hours, you can use the code EVENT, E-V-E-N-T, to receive 10% off any books you order online with Avid Reader. Now for the tech side of things tonight, because everyone's using a different computer or device, you'll have different settings. We unfortunately can't offer technical support during the event. And please note that you'll all be on mute for the conversation and Q&A section. However, at the end, I'll allow everyone to unmute yourselves so we can join together in thanking our special guests for this evening. I'll officially start the event tonight with an acknowledgement of country. Please join me from wherever you may be to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. From where I call home, Meanjin or Brisbane, I pay respect to the Yagara and Turrbal people, and to all elders past, present, and emerging. In the theme of NAIDOC 2020, I also acknowledge this land has always been and will always be a place of creativity, community, and rich storytelling. I'd now like to introduce you to our special guest this evening. Award-winning journalist Grantlee Kieza, OAM, held senior editorial positions at the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, and the Courier Mail for many years, and was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for his writing. He is a Walkley Award finalist and the author of 17 acclaimed books, including the recent bestsellers Macquarie, Banjo, Mrs. Kelly, Monash, Sons of the Southern Cross, and Bert Hinkler, a personal favourite of mine. We are in for a treat tonight with Grantlee discussing his latest book, Banks, with the addition of a slideshow. A very warm, avid reader welcome to you, Grantlee, and I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Really honoured to be here to talk about the amazing Joseph Banks, and I'll just hit the share screen so I can show you some of these photographs. This is very much a visual presentation. That's the way Banks operated, as a visual scientist. He took a team of artists and scientists with him around the world to document everything that he saw and experienced on the great voyage of the Endeavour. So I'd like to share some of those pictures with you and some of his experiences. So here we go. This is the 17th book that I've written. It's an absolute treat to document the life of such an incredible character as Banks. This is a book, it's about adventure, it's about lust, it's about sex, it's about discoveries of new peoples and new places, but mostly it's a book about passion. One man's incredible passion to teach the world as much as he could about the natural world that's all around us. It was, if you've seen the book in the shops, or if you already have a copy of it, you'll appreciate what a beautiful publication it really is. The designers and the artists involved in putting this book together have done a magnificent job. It really is a gorgeous book to look up and to have in your hands. It's a work of art itself. It was Banks who brought back the first illustrations and the first examples of the kangaroo to Europe. And he spent his life learning about other peoples and other cultures, other fauna and flora from around the world. His great passion in life was to teach the world about the wonders of what he saw as the creation around all of us. This, as I was saying a little earlier, the 17th book that I've written, you may be familiar with some that I've written in the past. Bert Hinkler, the great Queensland aviator, Sir John Monash, the great military leader of World War I, one of the great thinkers and inventors, a great inventive mind that he had, the great elastic brain that he had to not only lead his troops to victory in the war, but to electrify a large section of Australia when he came back as the boss of the Victorian Electricity Commission. Other books include the Ned Kelly story, Mrs. Kelly, Banjo Patterson, the great Australian writer, and Lachlan Macquarie, the great colonial governor, who I was astonished to find actually reported to Joseph Banks rather than the British government. Banks held such sway over the British government and the early days of Australian life that all the early colonial governors actually reported to Joseph Banks. Before embarking on my career as a writer of historical biographies, I was very heavily involved in the boxing world. That's me on the right with a very famous Australian boxer, Jeff Fennick, who I regard as probably the greatest boxer that Australia has produced. I helped train Jeff for all these world title wins. And I also spent many years covering sport and boxing around the world. This was a fight in Atlantic City in 1989. The promoter of this fight was a very interesting character. He was a real estate tycoon and casino owner with a big shock of red hair. His name was Donald Trump. And he's, you just can't see him in the screen, but he's just at the right hand of the boxing ring. So that was my first and only meeting with Donald Trump in his days as a boxing promoter. He went on to bigger and perhaps worse things since then. But to the subject at hand, Joseph Banks, the incredible man, the incredible figure in science in the English-speaking world for at least half a century. He was a big, in his youth, he was a big, burly, rugged outdoorsman, willing to take on all sorts of adventures, willing to risk his life day after day to promote science and knowledge of the natural world. He came from very big money. He was an extraordinarily wealthy young man. This is the home in which his parents were married in the mid-1700s, Burley House in Lincolnshire. At 21, Banks inherited a vast fortune of his own. His father passed away and Banks came into what was essentially, in today's terms, a multi-million-dollar annual income. He owned a grand home in London. He owned this estate in Lincolnshire called Revesby. And if anyone knows Sydney, the suburb of Revesby is named after this estate, as is Bankstown after Joseph Banks. He also owned a variety of lead mines around England. So he was a very, very rich young man. As a child, he was quite a delicate looking boy, very soft featured, but he always had a great love for the world and the things in the world. And his great ambition in life was to understand as much of the world as he possibly could. He grew up very fast though. Banks went to the best public schools in England. He went to Eton, Harrow, and then Oxford University. But his great mentor as a young man was this extraordinary, very odd-looking character. He's the Earl of Sandwich, John Montagu. We know him today as the man who gave us the sandwich. And the reason that came about was because he was an inveterate gambler. And when he was sitting at the table playing cards, he didn't like to use knife and fork. The card games would go on for hours into the small hours of the morning. So he would insist that his servants brought him slices of bread with meat in between it. That's how we got the sandwich. But in his day, Sandwich was known for much more than that. He was very much a sexual kinkster. He was one of the prime movers behind a club called the Hellfire Club in England, which was practiced all sorts of debauchery and all sorts of kinky things went on there. But for Banks's purposes, he was also Secretary of the Navy. And when Banks was a young man, Sandwich, who knew him through their adjoining properties in Lincolnshire, Sandwich became a very, very powerful ally for Banks because he was able to help Banks organise great voyages of discovery around the world. Another of Banks's great mentors was this man, Carl Linnaeus. He was the great scientist who gave us the classification terms for all living things, including Homo sapiens for mankind. Banks was very, very heavily influenced by him and his writings, and he wanted to classify, like Linnaeus, as many plants and animals around the world that he possibly could. One of the very first adventures that Banks went on, even though he was a very, very rich young man, and many of his friends spent their fortunes on wine, women, and voyages of sexual discovery throughout the flesh pots of Europe, Banks wanted to see the great adventures that he could in distant parts of the world. One of the first adventures he went on was when he was only about 22 or 23. He went to the north of Canada looking for polar bears and all these great beasts of the ice world. He said the islands of ice, he called it, the icebergs going past. He wanted to document what this life was like for the fishermen who made their living in that part of the world. And he wanted to bring news of that back to Britain. Banks saw all sorts of creatures in the north of America that are no longer with us. They were hunted very soon out to extinction, to his great dismay, including this animal, which looks like a penguin. It's called the Great Orc. He spent several months in Canada documenting life there, what it was like for the intrepid people who lived in that realm of the world. And he collected great vast diaries and great studies of all the specimens, of both animal and vegetable. His sister Sophia helped him with a lot of the documentation of that. In fact, she was his lifelong collaborator. She was a woman of science herself who probably doesn't get the credit that she really deserves, but she helped Banks throughout his life. Even when he was married, she lived with Banks and his wife until the end of her days. And she was a great scientific collaborator for him. But of course, Banks's most famous collaboration was with this man, Joseph. This is Captain James Cook. Joseph Banks and Cook formed a very, very powerful alliance. And in 1768, in a very small ship that had been used to transport coal from Newcastle to London, they converted it into a vessel for oceanic voyage and discovery. And with about 90 men on board, they undertook what was then the greatest scientific voyage of all time aboard the Endeavour. They set off from England in 1768. Banks took with him a team of 8 scientists and artists to document everything that they could. And he kept these diaries. Banks, he was a meticulous diary keeper. He documented everything that he saw for the purposes of furthering scientific knowledge around the world. He also formed a great friendship with another man on board that he took with him. That was his assistant, Daniel Solander, who was a great Swedish scientist. Also on board the Endeavour was this man, Charles Clerk, who was absolutely, totally devoted to Banks, even on his deathbed. He was minutes away from dying, and all he could do was had someone write a letter to Banks thanking him for all the great scientific knowledge that he had brought to the world. Another man on the voyage was this guy, John Gore, who was, history records him as the first kangaroo shooter of all time because he brought down a kangaroo in North Queensland so Banks could take it back to England and astonish Europe with this incredible creature that Banks referred to as a kind of giant hopping mouse. They hadn't studied it all that closely. They didn't really know about marsupials at the time, but he took this creature back to England. It weighed over 40 kilos, and it was the great hit of the late 1700s. And another man on board was Banks, a young Scottish artist named Sidney Parkinson, whom Banks had hired to record and document all the great discoveries that they were making. He was only a young guy, and Banks had him working overtime in the little cabin on board the Endeavour, drawing the flowers, the fish, the sharks, all the creatures that they met on their 3-year voyage. It was quite extraordinary, the amount of detail that Banks and his team, including Parkinson, went to. Banks actually brought home more than 30,000 botanical and zoological specimens from that 3-year voyage on that tiny ship. It's amazing that they were able to fit all these things onto the craft. And of course, these drawings and paintings of what they encountered along that voyage served as a record until this time of what life was like 250 years ago, even in places like this. This is the port of Rio de Janeiro, where Banks and Cook arrived, not to a great fanfare, but they actually found a great deal of trouble in Rio de Janeiro because it was run by the Portuguese, who had great suspicion of this English boat arriving. The Portuguese governor couldn't believe that men would sail around the world to look at plants and animals. And Banks had to actually sneak off the ship. He had to climb through a porthole, sneak away in a small boat to get on shore, where he collected all kinds of animals and plant life, including this specimen, which is still in the British Museum, this is a hummingbird nest that Joseph Banks put in his bag over 250 years ago to take back to England and show the European people just what sort of creatures existed in the Southern Hemisphere. To give you an idea of just the bravery and the absolute courage that these men undertook, sailing around the world in a small ship, braving all sorts of hailstorms and tropical storms. They sailed down close to the Antarctic, where they were in danger of freezing winds. And that's a picture that another of the artists, Alexander Buchan, drew of the Endeavour against the great foreboding, fearsome coastline of South America. Banks, as I was saying, was an intrepid man. Many of his young friends were sauntering around Europe on what they called the Grand Tour, in the flesh pots of Paris and Rome. But Banks instead was camping out in the open skies while his artists documented the lives of the indigenous people of South America, the way that they lived, the food that they ate, their customs, their lifestyles. One of the first principles that Banks had undertaken was that he wanted to have the most accurate record possible, the most meticulous record possible of strange places and of customs of people that Europeans knew very, very little about. So his artists worked overtime making hundreds of drawings of the people and the animals and the plants that they encountered. One of the most important missions, though, of the Endeavour was to record what's called the transit of Venus. It was the transit of the planet Venus across the face of the sun. And at the time, in 1770 or 1769, that time period in history, it was essential for helping with celestial navigation, for helping chart the solar system in a way, so it could also help seagoing voyages with their navigation. In those days, of course, there was no radar, no sonar, no radio. You had to navigate by the stars, and the transit of Venus became such an important measuring stick to help navigators from that time on. In Tahiti, one of the things that really captivated Banks was the breadfruit, a plant that grew plentifully there. And Banks really saw this as a starchy vegetable that could go on to help feed the world, especially amongst poorer peoples. Banks was very much on improving agriculture and improving science as an economic benefit to the British Kingdom. And he saw breadfruit, the cultivation of that, as a really important milestone for the development of the British colonies. When the Endeavour reached Tahiti, they spent several months there. Banks was fascinated by the Tahitian people, the way they dressed, the muscular men. He found their lifestyle quite extraordinary. Their free and easy attitude towards sexuality, their customs, their hunting ways, their primitive but very successful methods of agriculture. He documented the extraordinary lavish houses that some of them lived in. He was amazed that people could build temples and palaces without the ironwork that Europeans were used to. But the thing that really captivated Banks for a long time was the Tahitian women. He was hardly off the boat when he arrived in Tahiti, when he was starting a number of love affairs with the Tahitian people. He was, even though he was certainly not a shy man when it came to sexuality, the Tahitian women really surprised him with a lot of their customs. But one thing that startled Banks about the Tahitians was that they didn't know about kissing on the lips. And being a young, very robust and very active man, he was very keen to teach as many of the women as he could about this European custom of kissing on the lips. In fact, some years later, he gave a speech in London, and in the audience was the great American scientist, Benjamin Franklin, who made copious notes about Banks's adventures in Tahiti and this incredible experience he had of educating Tahitian women about the European way of kissing on the lips. When when the Endeavour left Tahiti and headed for New Zealand as part of this great voyage, Banks, however, found the New Zealand men far less friendly than he had found the Tahitians. He found them extraordinarily tough and fierce. They were far less friendly than just about anybody he'd ever met. And the men of the Endeavour actually killed some of the Maori in skirmishes with the natives of New Zealand. The New Zealanders had actually killed a number of Europeans around that time who had dared to approach the shores of New Zealand. So Cook and Banks were taking no chances. He was even more startled, not just by the ferocity, but he was absolutely gobsmacked by their habit of cannibalism, the fact that they ate their enemies in battle. And Banks was absolutely stunned. He and Cook were coming along a beach one time, and they found a group of Maori eating some human arms and legs. And Banks was, of course, repulsed. He felt revulsion at this for a time, but when he finally got his senses back together, he managed to do a deal with some of the Maori. He actually swapped a pair of his old linen underpants. They were captivated. The Maori were captivated by this new cloth that Banks had shown them. Banks actually swapped a pair of his linen underpants for a Maori head from a young warrior who had been killed in battle. So it was absolutely eye-opening experience for so many of these death-defying adventurers as they sailed through the South Pacific. And the other startling thing that Banks remarked upon time and time again was the breathtaking coastline of New Zealand. That's the mount that's now known as Mount Taranaki on the North Island of New Zealand. Banks was hard at work the whole time that he was away, 3 years of virtually, apart from his romantic endeavours, virtually non-stop work, documenting everything he experienced. This is a Maori war canoe that Sydney Parkinson drew for him. Banks wanted to take back everything that he possibly could about his experiences there. And in fact, one of the Tahitians that Banks had brought on the Endeavour with him, an astrologer named Tupai, actually drew Banks. That's him with the ponytail bartering with a Maori for a lobster, a very rudimentary drawing, but certainly Banks created a great deal of respect wherever he went. And it's extraordinary. I always find it extraordinary that these men spent 3 years in this tiny little ship, battling hazardous conditions the whole time, never knowing what they were going to find. They literally went off the map. They didn't really know where a lot of these places, even if they actually existed. They heard vague reports about the east coast of the land known as New Holland. They had seen Abel Tasman's charts from 150 years ago showing where New Zealand was, but it was 150 years later that Cook and Banks headed for there, and they just hoped that Tasman was right with his calculations. There's a lot of trust that they were putting in old maps. After visiting New Zealand, of course, Cook and Banks headed for the east coast of New Holland. They didn't get a particularly great reception. They were the first Europeans on record to arrive on the east coast of what we now call Australia. And they met some very ferocious Gawegal warriors who brandished spears at them, threw spears at them. Banks wrote about them carrying short swords and also carrying rounded swords that we now know to be boomerangs. Cook actually shot one of the Gawegal in the legs with light birdshot to scare them off, and a sort of an uneasy truce existed for a bit over a week as Banks and Cook anchored in Botany Bay and went around surveying what we now know as Sydney. They were looking at all the rare fauna and flora, covering great tracts of land, documenting a lot of the language of the Indigenous people, and making as many notes as they could about all these strange, incredible sights that they were seeing, the first time that Europeans had seen anything like this. One of the plants that Banks noted and took back is now known as the Banksia. His name lives on in the Banksia. They saw a startling array of bird life, really astonishing creatures that Europeans had not seen before. But even though they were intrepid, they were going to places that had not been charted properly, and they soon ran into trouble sailing up the east coast of Australia when they reached the barrier reef. The shoals were so hazardous, so dangerous for mariners even today. And of course, Cook was pretty much the first European to sail through there. And it wasn't long before, even though they were sailing through a tropical paradise, that the Endeavour became, it ran headlong into a piece of coral rock, and the underneath of the ship was torn apart. The outcome was that they almost died out on the reef. Banks had to work. Now, Banks was a very rich man. He wasn't used to manual work, but he had to work overtime with the rest of the crew, trying to pump water out of the ship so it didn't sink, as monstrous surf threatened them from the other side of the reef. Eventually, Cook managed to right the ship and get it to a place that we now know as the Endeavour River, and that's the Endeavour on its side on the Endeavour River. And the men of the ship, Banks and Cook, stayed there for about 7 weeks. They set up a camp there. They once again managed to sight the giant hopping mouse that Banks had seen and made notes of, and John Gore shot one so that Banks could take it back to England. But it wasn't just that they were doing. They were also meeting and talking with the local Indigenous people of that time. They spent weeks talking with them. They even had, I guess, what is the very first reconciliation ceremony between blacks and whites in Australia, because the men of the Endeavour were stealing all the turtles from the area, putting the local Aboriginal people into a fury, and there was quite a melee, or quite a threatened melee, breaking out between the two sides, and eventually they sat down together on the beach. They kneeled down together and sorted out their problems, so that they essentially left in peace when it came time for the Endeavour to leave the Great Barrier Reef. But they learned a great deal about the Indigenous people, the Indigenous customs. They took back so many samples of the plants, and they headed back to England with more than 30,000 zoological and botanical specimens. Sadly, though, if you know the Endeavour story, more than a third of the people who set out from England died on the return voyage, including the ill-fated artist Sidney Parkinson. But Banks was a big, hardy soul, and he returned to England in surprisingly rude health. So many of his peers aboard the boat had died terrible deaths, and Banks was actually quite despondent when he got back, because the burials at sea had really made him quite morbid and morose. But it wasn't long before he returned to high spirits, and he became a darling of the press. That's a caricature of him as the butterfly catcher, the famous butterfly catcher, who soon became known as the greatest action adventure hero in Great Britain. He was lauded by the press. In fact, his fame and his wealth and his position in society meant that he was really fawned upon by the press of the time. And James Cook, who had done so much in actually commanding the ship, because he came from very much a working class background, he was relegated to the position of really a glorified bus driver by the press of the time. They presented it as always as Mr. Banks's voyage on which Lieutenant Cook sailed. So Banks really stole a lot of Cook's thunder there, but he milked the publicity for all that he could, and he'd seen a lot of very strange creatures in his time sailing with the Endeavour. He'd seen some fabulous beasts, but I write in the book that Banks had never seen a creature with a head so big as his own when he got back from the Endeavour adventure. His ego became out of control. This is yet another story in a newspaper story mocking him now because of his massive ego, and a lot of his sexual exploits in Tahiti had come to the fore, so that he was, a lot of the press before long wanted to cut him down to size. His reputation as a playboy continued. This is an excerpt from one of, I guess, what you would call the tabloid press of the time, in which they call him the circumnavigator, with one of his lady friends. It was a little bit like the Tatler pages today. In the late 1700s, Banks was very, very much in the news as a matinee hero would be today. But his first love, of course, was always adventure and teaching people about the natural world. He wanted to go on another voyage with Cook. In fact, the Royal Navy approved another voyage with Cook, a second voyage to the South Pacific, which was going to be even bigger than the voyage on the Endeavour. Banks was going to take a team of 15 with him this time, all sorts of artists and scientists, and he was also going to take his own band to entertain him while he was out on the high seas. But he, because of his demands for the team that he wanted with him, the ship on which they were going to discover had to be reconfigured, and it made the ship unseaworthy because of Banks's all of Banks's changes. Banks suddenly decided that he was a master mariner and knew more about ships and sailing than people like Cook and the Royal Navy. So when the Royal Navy informed him that they couldn't go through with the ship the way that he wanted it, and the thing almost capsized on the Thames in a trial run, Banks threw a hissy fit on the wharf as he was getting ready to depart, took all his gear off, and Cook set sail with his crew for the second voyage of the South Pacific without Banks. And Banks always regretted his actions in costing himself a voyage to the Pacific again. But Banks being a very, very adventurous man, he took all his stuff off Cook's ship, and he formed a new voyage. He took the team that he'd assembled, the 15 of them, and they went to, of all places, Iceland, because Banks wanted to climb a volcano and see how a volcano worked. He wanted to gaze firsthand on these great mountains of fire, and also what he called the volcanoes of water, which are the geysers in Iceland. Banks wanted to study them up close, so he took his team with him, and he spent several weeks in Iceland reporting on just these great geographical and geothermal wonders. Banks also became a great promoter of cross-cultural dialogue in Europe. This is a man named Omai, who was a Tahitian who had sailed to England when Cook's second voyage was returning home. He had met Banks on the first voyage of Cook way back in 1769. He wanted to go to England so he could tell his people. He wanted to do a reverse bank. He wanted to go to England so he could tell his people about all the wonders in the world where Mr. Banks lived. So Banks sort of became his escort around Europe for several months. He introduced him to the high society of England. He introduced him to the king, and Omai was able to go back eventually to Tahiti and tell them of a strange and wonderful world in which Mr. Banks lived. Banks had been, as I was saying earlier, the great action adventure hero of Britain, but a stunning transformation came over him when he met the lady who was going to be his wife. Banks had been a notorious playboy, but it seems when he met the right girl, he settled down to a very, very conservative life in this great mansion in Soho in England, and he became very much the preeminent conservative backbone of British science. And it was a role he would continue to have for the next 50 years. And in the book, I make the point that this was, even though Banks had sailed on this great adventure with Cook and seen so many wonderful things and been to almost up to the Arctic Circle as a young man, this really became his great love, organising and inspiring others to follow the dreams that he had pursued, to go around the world. Banks became pretty much a country squire. He'd spend weeks on his estate fishing and enjoying the good life in the countryside. This is a later photograph, a later picture, obviously, of his wife, Lady Dorothea. It's interesting. Banks had been notorious for his amorous adventures as a young man, but the gossip press were out to get him in later life. They often wrote of his marriage to Lady Dorothea, saying they couldn't really see the attraction. They were very, very cruel to her in many ways, but Banks loved her dearly, and they were married for 50 years. Banks, of course, became also a great proponent of gardens around the world, including the Kew Gardens in London and gardens in India, in the West Indies. And of course, his disciples had a great bearing on gardens in Australia as well. He was also a great promoter of agriculture in Britain and livestock and the breeding of livestock. And it was because of him that the British acquired merino sheep, which eventually found their way to Australia and became the basis of a great merino flock on the backs of which this country rode for many, many years. Banks in later life became this great regal figure presiding over meetings of the Royal Society. He was in effect the longest serving president of the Royal Society. And in that position, he was effectively the most important man in England in the scientific realm. In fact, you could even say that he was the most important man in world science for virtually half a century, because it was Banks who funded and organised and inspired so many other voyages of exploration. It was on Banks's say-so, and not a lot of people really realise this, it was on Banks's say-so that the British actually sent the first fleet to Botany Bay, arriving in 1788. Banks appeared before a parliamentary committee looking into the problem of transportation. The war with America, the War of Independence was going on. Britain couldn't send convicts to America anymore, so they had to look for a new place. They thought about Africa, but they called Banks in for his opinion, and he thought that Botany Bay would be the perfect place for not just a penal settlement, but for a new colony, a new British colony, a trading post. And what was also crucial to Banks and the British government at that time was a naval base from which they could fend off voyages of expansion or attempts at global expansion by the French and the Dutch. So it was on Banks's say-so. The very first governor was appointed, that was Arthur Phillip. He reported directly to Banks. He even for a time was, believe it or not, collecting the heads of deceased Aborigines to send back Banks and other European scientists for study. So even though Arthur Phillip was the big man in town, of old Sydney town, his boss was Joseph Banks. This is another character crucial to the Banks story. This is young William Bligh. It was on Banks's say-so that Bligh got the command of a ship called the Bounty and went off to Tahiti to bring back breadfruit plants that they were going to take to the West Indies to feed the slave population over there. But of course, Banks was a very forgiving sort of fellow. He put up with Bligh's irascible personality. It's quite interesting, even though history has painted Bligh as this terrible martinet and this terrible bully, you read the correspondence, and I was able to read a lot of the correspondence between Bligh and Banks, and Bligh's very fawning over Banks. It's quite odd to see the respect and the admiration that Bligh has for Banks. He really is treating him like this boss. In fact, Banks actually gets, this is a drawing of the mutiny on the Bounty when, of course, the crew mutinied and tossed Bligh and some loyalists into the boat and tossed all the breadfruit plants out into the ocean just off the coast of Tonga, as they were heading to New Guinea as they were heading to the West Indies with all the breadfruit plants. But in later years, Banks, he saw that Bligh should be given a second chance. So he helped him become governor of New South Wales. And it's quite remarkable to see the correspondence between Bligh and Banks. Banks is saying to him, look, you've had your problems, but I can get you a good job in this new colony in New South Wales. You can get twice the money that the present governor's getting out there. That's Philip Gidley King. You can live like a prince out there. It'll be absolutely fantastic. You'll be more or less the king of your little realm out there. You can take your wife and your children out. It'll be absolutely fantastic. But of course, Bligh's personality managed to stuff that up as well, and he was deposed as the governor in the Rum Rebellion. Banks had his many critics, because during the French Revolution, Banks believed that there shouldn't really be partisanship, that scientists was above warfare and revolution. And when the French were at war with the English, Banks said that scientists should be impartial and should be neutral. So a lot of the British press portrayed him as this fool, as this as this botanical butterfly. But Banks overcame that. He was able to organise the voyage of this man, Constantine Phipps, to the Arctic, one of the first great voyages to the northern part of the globe, in which there were reports back of, once again, the icebergs. Banks's reach was very much around the world. He organised voyages for George Vancouver that went to Hawaii and, of course, to the northwest coast of what we now call Canada and the United States. That was Vancouver, who also sailed into King George Sound in Western Australia. And, of course, the great voyages of Matthew Flinders, including the Circumnavigation Australia, all happened because of Joseph Banks. It's remarkable to see this famous explorer, his letters writing to Banks, begging for help because he wants to take this voyage around Australia and he wants to get Banks's help in securing a ship and payment for a crew. And of course, we know that Matthew Flinders took off in this little ship, the Investigator, and proved that what we now call Australia was an island not connected to anything. And from that voyage of the Investigator, we have these beautiful illustrations by another of Banks's disciples and employees, Ferdinand Bauer. Banks astonished Europe with tales of this creature, a mammal that laid eggs, the platypus. He was also the man who inspired the work of Alan Cunningham, who we know as from Cunningham's Gap. You know, Banks's reach was so global. Cunningham had gone to South Africa and then he'd come out to Australia and became one of the greatest explorers on the Australian mainland. And in later life, Banks, he oversaw British science, as I say, for half a century, well up into the 1820s, when he was still seen as the most important man in the Australian colonies. He's now remembered with tributes around the world, and we, of course, have tributes to him in this country at places like Bankstown, Revesby, Banks Island, and various other places in both Australia and New Zealand. He was, as I contend in the book, surely one of the greatest scientific minds and one of the most intrepid explorers the world has ever seen. So I hope you enjoy the book. It's a really, really beautiful book. Thank you very much for listening to the Zoom presentation. I'm not that familiar with the Zoom, so I hope you got a little something out of those illustrations and the story of, as I say, a truly, truly remarkable man.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Grantlee. I'm thoroughly enjoying myself, and I can tell you, I don't know if you probably see the commentary coming through on the side there, but we have got a few questions and some feedback just saying what a treat this is with the historical information with the visual medium, the anecdotes and that sort of thing. So just incredible. All right, I'm going to get underway with a couple of questions if you're ready.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'll start off with, we've had one from Janet firstly. Janet would like to, she says earlier, Grantlee, you showed us a picture of Banks's journals. Now I'm guessing she's saying, did you actually see them firsthand, or did you use, Banks's actual journals in researching the book?
Well, I used Banks's journals, but I used printed copies, not the actual journal. I used copies that are freely available on the internet. You can get copies of, I think it's from Gutenberg. I think they've published some of Banks's journals. They're remarkable diaries. They're also, it's incredible. The diary that he had from Canada, his first great voyage, that's housed with the, I think it's the Royal Geographical Society of South Australia, of all places. They have it down there, which is quite remarkable. But there are printed versions of it around that are free to use. The same as Cook's journal. You can read Cook's journal. And in fact, it's interesting, Cook and Banks often compared notes. They would often write very, very similar things in their journals. Very, very similar, as though they were comparing notes, because the journals were going to be made public when they got back.
Mm. So yeah, so there was, you didn't go to any physical archives or sort of museums?
Well, in England, I went to lots of museums, of course, the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Maritime Museum at Greenwich, which has a lot of Banks memorabilia. including one of the cannons that was cast off the ship on the Great Barrier Reef to lighten it so that they could get it off the rocks. Yeah. Wow. And there's another cannon. I actually for a long time lived in the Sutherland Shire in Sydney, which is near Kurnell, where Banks and Cook came on shore. And there's a Discovery Museum there as well, the Endeavour Museum. They have a cannon as well from that incident where they had to throw the cannons off the ship to lighten it.
There you go. Fantastic. So thank you for that question, Janet. So Sue would like to know, she says, we know of Banks's contributions to botanical science, among other areas, but did he and his collections make a mark in the developing science of ornithology, so being the field of the study of birds?
Well, yeah, Banks did. It sounds a little bit crazy when you read the journals, because every second day Banks is shooting a bird out of the sky. You think he's this, but that's the way scientists in those days collected samples. And Banks does make the note that there's times when there's so many birds around, he could have shot hundreds, but his mission was only to shoot one of each species. And he brought back, and you can see them in the British Museum still, some of the birds that he brought back, some of the beautiful birds from Australia, for instance, are quite extraordinary. They're in the collection. A lot of them have been damaged over time, of course, because it's 250 years, and Banks's methods of preserving them was in spirit. So not as scientific as today, but he did bring back extraordinary samples of the fauna from Australia and New Zealand. And he would, interestingly, Banks was not a selfish man. He would share his research, and he would even share his samples of these things before they were housed in the British Museum. He would share them with other collectors so that they could study them as well. And and what I was mentioning before, it's quite a confronting part of the book about the human heads. Banks had scientists all around the world that were collecting heads of peoples of different populations. They would have Polynesian heads, they would have Russian heads, and Banks took it upon himself to get from the early governors heads of deceased Indigenous people from Australia. There was quite a trade going on.
And so, second part to Sue's question, and she says, do you have any reflections on the relationship between Banks and other key figures in Kew Gardens?
Well, yeah, there was Philip Miller, who was his great mentor there at the Chelsea Gardens. But Banks, I guess, was instrumental in helping those great gardens develop, certainly by his association with the king and with the royalty at the time. The king and his mother were very much in wanting to develop English gardens as botanical gardens to be the envy of the world. And Banks took it upon himself very much to make sure that the collection there was better and stocked with rarer plants than anywhere else on the globe. So in that sense, Banks was really at the forefront of developing the British garden situation.
Okay.
And he even to the extent that he was collecting plants, and I go through this in the book, he was collecting plants from all sorts of, he had collectors around the world, in the West Indies, wherever the British had some sort of settlement, Banks would have collectors there sending things back. And not just for the garden as well, but also as ways of studying improvements that they could make to agriculture, ways that they could beat the French in their agricultural processes, or the Dutch. He wanted to, even things like cochineal dye, he wanted to corner the market and that to have it as a British export.
Okay, and we haven't had any more questions, but I'll just ask one from, we have two Janets with us tonight. So Janet would also just like to know if Banks gave any credit to his sister for assisting with him with his research, and is she correct in thinking that Banks's wife assisted with writing up notes as well?
Oh, to some degree, yeah. Banks's wife, Dorothea, she was a collector in her own right. She collected porcelains and things like that, and she did assist him in many ways with a lot of his documentation. But it was Sarah Sophia, she was a great collector of all sorts of paraphernalia. And in fact, there's a part of the British Museum devoted to her collections. But certainly in the early stages, Banks didn't get married until he was in his late 30s. So his great voyages, specifically on the Endeavour, but also Iceland and to North America, Sarah Sophia, who he called Sophie, she was his backstop in all of that, compiling the diaries, copying the diaries, and also it's interesting, even in things like some of Banks's death-defying adventures, she would make marginal notes. There's a situation in Canada where Banks is almost killed, and she wrote in the marginal notes, "Surely the hand of Providence." So those two diaries are very, very important in the Banks story, and she had a major hand in compiling it, literally.
I think it's always fascinating to know the story, a little bit about the women behind, the voyages, the adventurers. And Victoria has a couple of questions. So did Banks have any input with plants and scurvy, or was it Cook?
Well, both. They were both at the forefront of treating scurvy, understanding it, safeguarding it. In fact, Cook, as well known, used to take the sour cabbage with him, the sauerkraut, hoping that the men would eat it. And he had a trick where if they weren't keen on the taste of it, he would have it served to the officers and make a big rumour that the officers, it was just for them, and that the common sailors would never get it because it was such a delicacy. And Cook thought by doing that, he would create a demand for it, that the men would eat it because they thought that it was something only reserved for the elite of the ship. So Cook had that trick, but Banks was very much wherever he went looking for green vegetation that would help ward off scurvy. And he found that in what's often known as New Zealand spinach. There's lots of different terms for it. It grows in Australia as well, but he was at the forefront of gathering or getting that gathered to be cooked, and to also even to be brought back to England for further study. And Banks also had lots of remedies himself that he took with him for the men. He had a sort of a lemon-juiced lime and brandy sort of concoction that a doctor who'd been studying scurvy had given him. And Banks used to give that to the men and his friends who'd come down with conditions, if they had loose teeth or if their gums were sore or whatever. He was always feeding different people on the ship with this concoction that he had, and making further studies into what could be done to alleviate it.
Definitely a man of many, many talents.
Now, he was a very eccentric guy too. A lot of people, it's amazing just the little things that I learned about Banks. He was such a detailed scientist. He studied everything meticulously, and he got into the habit throughout his life, for whatever reason, of weighing everybody. Anybody that came to the house had to get on the scales. And so he's got all these great charts of what everybody weighed that came to his house, including his own family members. And it's quite startling how much their weight went up over time. His wife was about 55 kilos when they got married, and later in life, she's about 85 kilos. And Banks goes from about 85 kilos to about 110 kilos, within the course of time. It's quite a remarkable little chart, just a window into this guy who was so meticulous. He wanted to study every possible thing that he could about people.
Yeah. Oh, how fascinating. I can't wait to get into the book to find out more of these, these quirks, and also his findings.
It's interesting that the cover of the book, it's a very beautiful cover, but it's actually from a famous portrait, a painted portrait of Banks. And if you look closely, he's actually wearing some of the paraphernalia that he brought back from the voyage. He's wearing a Maori cloak over his European clothes. And if you look at the original painting, he's got all sorts of Maori and Aboriginal artifacts with him that he's collected. He wants to present himself in that portrait as this great global action hero who's gone to parts of the world that are so exotic, almost like a little bit like a James Bond's kind of movie, going to all these exotic locations that most people couldn't go to or would never see. And he's absolutely thrilling people with the sight of these things, like a mystery tour.
Yep. Victoria would also like to ask about how you feel about cancel culture versus 19th century normality. Interesting
Well, yeah,
question there.
that's such a big thing now. You know, like a lot of Banks's ideas, if you look at them through the 21st century lens, are very coarse. You know, his attitudes towards Indigenous people, he saw many of them as savages, many of them as not possessing anything. That land was there to be taken. No one really owned it, and therefore the colonisation of Australia. But I say it's very, very difficult to judge a person in the 1700s from our time. For his time, Banks had quite a benevolent attitude to Indigenous peoples, quite a kind attitude. And in fact, even though as a young man, many of his friends owned slaves and made fortunes from the slave trade, Banks was pretty much opposed to the slave trade. Not just for the cruelty, but also for economic reasons. He thought that a paid workforce would work much harder than people in chains and bonded labour. And later on, he became a great supporter of the anti-slavery campaigner William Wilberforce. He became a great supporter of his, and he wrote often about what joy there must be to see the freedom of the slaves in Haiti, for instance, when they gained their freedom. So, as I say, I think Banks, and even when it came to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultures, Banks wasn't like a lot of the people of his time, the invaders who destroyed. Banks wanted to study and understand people. He had a great respect for the people of South America that he met. You know, he drank with them and ate with them and wanted to know how they lived, and he made copious notes about the way that they lived. The same when he met the Indigenous people in North Queensland. He wanted to know how they lived, what they got from the land, and perhaps how Europeans could benefit from their knowledge of harnessing the land. So in that sense, I think it's, you know, it's wrong to portray Banks as something as he wasn't, something from a 21st century lens for a man who lived in totally different times.
Yep.
And for me, like, I'm glad I live in Australia. I'm glad he decided that this was a good place to settle. You know.
And so I think we'll have time for one last question. Maybe we'll squeeze in two, just depending on, let's have a look. So Janet here has asked her comment is the extent of influence of Banks is quite astounding. So Grantlee, are you able to share with us your next book topic?
Well, it's going to be Henry Lawson as a companion piece to my book on Banjo Patterson. You know, Henry Lawson was the flip side of Banjo. Banjo was from quite a prosperous family and had a high-paying job as a well-to-do partner in a legal firm. Henry Lawson, he did it tough all his life. He was probably beset with manic depression, but such a beautiful, beautiful writer, and such a great storyteller, and such a great seer into the hearts and souls of the early colony, and especially the working man and the struggles that they had, and the working women. I mean, his beautiful story, the drover's wife. I mean, you know, there's few better short stories in Australia ever written than that. And the thing that I really find remarkable, Henry got a few shillings for writing that for the Bulletin, and yet now people have transported into something else, and they get hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants to as part of the process. You know, and yet he was the guy who originated it all.
Wow.
Such a beautiful writer.
And I think we'll leave it there. Just a question, quick comment from Victoria. She said, great presentation. She says she's in Victoria and will let everyone know about the book. Thank you, avid reader, and thank you, Grantlee.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was just wonderful. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope I was okay on the Zoom.
Absolutely. Yeah, it all went really smoothly. It was great to have the presentation. That's a first for us, so that's wonderful to know, to see all that, that visual collected resource in one spot. So once the recording goes up on the YouTube, you know, obviously just let everyone know, if you're here tonight and you know someone who might be interested in viewing Grantlee's talk tonight, please do share that, and go and grab a copy of the book. We've got some, probably a limited time, but we've got some signed copies available in store at Avid Reader as well. So if you'd like to get those, please pop in this week. Grantlee, did you have any final sort of comments or anything like that before we open up the room to all give you a big round of applause?
No, I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me and for setting this all up. It's been wonderful. You know, the fact that we can do this and in the COVID era, it's really great. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I think, as I say, I was just astounded by the life that Banks had, the absolute bravery of the man, and not just the bravery, that's just one component. It was the great passion he had for teaching the world about the wonders all around us.
And thank you for bringing that to us as well. So thank you for all that you do and your contributions to Australian literature. It is astounding. So everyone should be able to unmute yourselves now. So please join me in a big clap if you have the ability to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'll get us started.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and hopefully, Grantlee, we'll see you in, who knows, 2021. Hopefully, we'll have a in-person event with you.
Yeah. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a great night. Bye.